It still stings when I remember how peaceful things used to be. The kind of peace you don't even realize you have until someone rips it out from under you. That lake behind my house wasn't just a view. It was part of me. It was a place where my daughter learned to skip stones. A place where I drank coffee each morning watching herons glide low over the waterline. A place I rebuilt by hand after decades of neglect. I never imagined that the very community meant to protect this neighborhood would treat it like a threat. I moved to Crofton Landing 7 years after retiring from the Army Corps of Engineers. Back then, I still wore the tan lines of my helmet and the straight-backed posture the military drills into your bones. I wanted a quiet place where I could breathe. My wife had passed 2 years before, and my daughter Lucy was just starting high school. I needed stability, predictability. I thought I'd found it here in this suburb outside Asheville. Gated, clean, polite, maybe a little too polite. The lake bordered the rear third of my property. When I first bought the lot, it was little more than a mosquito swamp with algae so thick you could rake it like leaves. The developer had ignored it, and the HOA, well, they only cared about the clubhouse and the tennis courts. But I saw potential. Over 3 years, I invested close to $80,000 of my savings into cleaning it out, dredging it properly, restoring its native plants, and installing a natural overflow channel that reduced downstream erosion. I didn't just restore the lake, I made it livable again. The neighbors praised it. They fished from the bank. Their kids played near it. And the HOA, they nodded approvingly during their strolls, and never once raised a concern until recently. It started small, as it always does with these people. A passive-aggressive note from the HOA president, Denise Clymer-Karen, in every sense of the stereotype. It was just a friendly inquiry about the status of my lake and whether I had secured the proper permits for the runoff system I'd engineered. I replied cordially, attaching the permits I had pulled with the county years ago. No response. Then came the monthly board meeting. I never attended before. But that month, my name appeared on the agenda. No warning, no phone call. Just discussion of private water hazard, parcel number 44B. I showed up in slacks and a collared shirt expecting civility. What I got was a lecture. Denise stood at the front of the clubhouse conference room like she was running a courtroom. She wore that tight smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes, flanked by 2 board members who clearly had no idea what they were talking about. She claimed that my lake posed a serious risk of overflow and that recent heavy rains had flooded the Greenbelt Trail. I pointed out that the trail in question hadn't even been mowed in 2 years. No one laughed. "We have a responsibility," she said, "to protect the integrity of this community." I replied evenly, "Then maybe you should start with the storm drains that haven't been cleaned since 2016. That didn't go over well. I left that meeting with a bad taste in my mouth. But I didn't think they'd actually do anything. My lake was on my deeded property. It wasn't even listed in their community maintenance plan. I had the documentation, the topo maps, the engineering plans. I'd pulled the permits myself. If they were going to try to make this a legal matter, they were in for a fight. But at that point, I thought it was all noise, empty HOA saber rattling. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, I woke up to the sound of diesel engines rumbling behind my house. At first, I thought someone was doing road work. But when I looked out my back window, I saw 3 giant hoses snaking across the greenbelt pumps the size of motorcycles connected to flatbed trucks. Men in reflective vests were unspooling line down to the lake's edge. I stormed out there in nothing but my boots and gym shorts. "What the hell is going on?" I demanded. One of the workers, clearly a contractor, held up a clipboard and said, "Work order from the HOA. Emergency Water Management Protocol. Who authorized this?" He pointed toward the trail where Denise herself was standing, clipboard in hand, sunglasses on like she was leading a military op. I marched up to her. "Turn it off," I said. Her lips twitched upward. "It's for the safety of the neighborhood, Jack. You've left us no choice." "No choice," I laughed. "You don't have jurisdiction. This lake is on my land. We have legal advisement that says otherwise." "Then you'd better show me that advisement. Right now." But she didn't. She just gestured to the crew and walked away. Within hours, the pumps were roaring. Water surged down plastic tubing into the retention basin near the tennis courts. The surface of my lake dropped 6 inches that day. That night, I stood at the edge of the shoreline with a flashlight in my hand and rage in my chest. Frogs croaked in the shallows, unaware their home was vanishing. I could already see the dark exposed roots of cypress trees beginning to dry and curl. My dog Ranger sniffed nervously at the mud. I knew what was happening wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. But Denise had clearly counted on me being caught flat-footed. She underestimated how quickly I could mobilize. I went inside and dusted off the metal filing case where I kept every permit, every diagram, every signed inspection from the last 5 years. I had receipts, I had maps, and I had friends in the county water office. If they wanted a war, they were about to get one. 3 days after the pumps began roaring and the shoreline turned from lush to cracked clay, I received the letter. Not an email, not a knock at the door. A printed envelope, hand-delivered and tucked halfway into my mailbox, even though it clearly required a signature. That's how they operated under the radar, behind the curtains dripping with passive aggression, masked as formality. The envelope bore the Crofton Landing HOA seal, embossed like they were some kind of government agency. Inside was a 3-page declaration signed by Denise Clymer and stamped with what looked like a legal counsel's rubber approval. The language was sterile, bureaucratic, and packed with phrases like imminent risk, emergency mitigation authority, and dereliction of private waterway oversight. They accused me of failing to maintain a man-made body of water in accordance with Section 14.2 of the HOA Safety and Environmental Bylaws. I read it twice to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. They claimed the lake, my lake, posed a potential flood risk to adjacent community infrastructure in the event of continued precipitation beyond average annual projections. Never mind that I had personally designed the overflow spillway to accommodate 20-year flood cycles. Never mind that they'd never requested an environmental audit of any kind before. This wasn't about safety. This was about control. It got worse. The letter went on to say that due to my lack of cooperation and the absence of compliance documentation on file with the HOA board, they were exercising their right to emergency intervention. In other words, they were declaring environmental martial law over my backyard, and they hadn't even bothered to file a cease and desist. At the bottom of the letter was a line that made my blood boil. Please be advised that future obstruction of HOA-mandated mitigation procedures may be grounds for civil penalty or community-level legal action. Civil penalty, legal action. They were threatening me. I wanted to march over to the HOA office, right then tear the letter in half, and drop the pieces on Denise's precious marble desk. But I knew that was what she wanted, an outburst, an overstep. Instead, I picked up my phone and called someone I hadn't spoken to in years, Mark Pelham, a friend from my Corps days, who now worked in the city's watershed engineering division. He answered on the third ring. "Jack Mercer," he said, "haven't heard your voice since Kabul." I skipped the small talk. "Mark, I need your help. You remember that property I bought outside Asheville, the one with the lake?" "Sure. You said it had great bass fishing." "It did. The HOA is draining it." "Wait, what?" I explained everything. The pumps, the letter, the fact that they were bypassing the county entirely and acting like their covenants overrode state water rights. I could practically hear Mark's jaw tightening on the other end. "Jack," he said finally, "that's not just sketchy. It's probably illegal, especially if they're draining into a shared basin. Have they filed anything with environmental services? Not a thing. Then they're in violation, flat out." That was the first sliver of hope I'd felt in days. Mark promised to forward me the official permitting requirements for water diversion and environmental impact assessments for private lakes. Then he said something I didn't expect. "You know, I had a run-in like this 2 years ago. Different HOA. Same tactic. You're not the first they've tried to strong-arm." That stayed with me. It meant there was a pattern here. And patterns leave trails. I started digging. The next morning, I drove to the county clerk's office and requested all registered complaints, environmental filings, or legal exemptions filed by Crofton Landing HOA in the past 5 years. It took the woman at the desk 45 minutes and 2 trips to the back, but eventually she returned with a thin folder, a very thin folder. Inside were 3 documents. 1. A routine landscaping maintenance request from 2019. 2. A noise complaint log for an abandoned lot near the park. 3. A denied request to build a new playground within 50 feet of a stormwater outlet. Not a single permit request or filed justification for draining water bodies. No documentation of an environmental hazard, no flood assessment, no third-party inspection. They had nothing. I scanned the documents and emailed them to myself, then drove straight to the HOA's law firm, the one whose stamp had been at the bottom of the letter. The receptionist, a 20-something in a suit that didn't fit, asked if I had an appointment. I said no. But when I gave my name and said I was the homeowner whose lake was being drained, she asked me to wait. 15 minutes later, a junior associate, probably fresh out of law school, came out to speak with me. His handshake was limp, and he looked more nervous than I felt. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "we were told this matter had been resolved." "Resolved," I echoed. "You issued a threat of legal action against me." Well, he fumbled. "We were retained by the Crofton Landing HOA to review hypothetically the possibility of emergency environmental intervention. Any actions taken are solely the decision of the HOA board. So you didn't review the legality of draining a lake on private property." He blinked. "We were under the impression the lake was common area. It's not." He nodded slowly, visibly shaken now. "Then I'd recommend a reassessment of the facts." "Yeah," I said, "you do that." I left the office with a renewed sense of purpose and a confirmation that Denise was bluffing. She was acting without legal grounding, and worse, she was putting the HOA at liability risk they probably didn't even understand. That was when it hit me. This wasn't just about my lake. This was about negligence, about abuse of power, and about to turn very public. That night, I began building my case. I created a shared drive and uploaded every document deed, copies engineering plans, photos of the pumps, daily water level charts, copies of the HOA's letter, even a map overlay showing the exact boundaries of my property versus their greenbelt. Then I did what Denise probably never expected me to do. I invited neighbors over for coffee. 3 families showed up. I laid out everything. The documents, the photos, the fact that their docks, yes, their precious little fishing platforms built and maintained by the HOA, were now cracked and half sunken in dried mud. I didn't yell. I didn't point fingers. I let the evidence speak. One of them, a retired accountant named Russell, looked down at a photo of the dried shoreline and said, "She said it was to protect our homes, but it looks like she destroyed yours." "She didn't just destroy mine," I said. "She put all of you at risk." The next morning, Russell filed an anonymous request with the City Environmental Board to initiate an investigation into the HOA's actions. The storm had started. By the end of the first week, the water line had receded nearly 4 feet. What had once been a shimmering mirror reflecting the pines and birch around its rim was now a basin of cracked brown silt, stinking of rot, and lined with the skeletons of things that once lived. The pumps hadn't stopped. Not once. Not even overnight. They churned on like mechanical parasites, siphoning away the soul of this place. Each morning, I documented the damage with military precision photos. At the same coordinates, time-stamped logs of the pump operation drone footage I captured from a small UAV I had bought during my daughter's robotics phase. It wasn't just about proving a point anymore. It was about preserving the truth. Because I knew Denise would lie. She already had. My dog Ranger stopped approaching the shoreline, where he used to bound into the shallows and splash with wild joy. Now he stood yards back, tail low, whining at the foreign smell that filled the air. Decay. Not just of fish and frogs, but of the fragile balance I'd cultivated over years. Tadpole pools were now just pockets of dead algae. Heron nests were empty. I hadn't heard a bullfrog in 3 days. Meanwhile, the HOA doubled down. They posted signs around the clubhouse reading "Thank you for your patience" during flood prevention maintenance, as if they were repaving a sidewalk. One of their board members, a guy named Glenn Harrow, a part-time real estate agent with a God complex, put out a community update claiming preliminary success in lowering the lake to safe and manageable levels. Manageable, they'd turned a living lake into a grave. But even as the water vanished, so did their narrative. Neighbors began whispering. The ones who fished with their grandkids noticed the docks weren't just useless, now they were rotting fast. With the support beams fully exposed, the untreated wood swelled and cracked under the autumn sun. 2 docks had already started to tilt their bases, sinking unevenly into soft mud like broken teeth. It was only a matter of time before one collapsed. And when it did, I'd be there with a camera. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was strategizing. And the first tactical move came from Mark, my old friend, from the city's watershed division. He emailed me a full copy of the municipal water diversion regulations, which I printed and highlighted like I was cramming for a court-martial. The rules were clear. Any man-made changes to a natural body of water, including drainage, required a hydrological impact assessment, a notice to adjacent landowners, and a permit from the County Environmental Board. HOAs were not exempt, not even close. So I filed a formal complaint, not as a homeowner, but as an environmental stakeholder and former hydrological engineer, with standing under the county's private conservation clause. That got attention. A week later, 2 county inspectors showed up in khakis and boots, clipboards in hand, asking where the unauthorized pumps were located. I smiled and pointed. "You'll want to check the intake lines by the willow tree," I said. "That's where the runoff drain ties into the HOA's clubhouse retention basin." They took photos, lots of them. I noticed the younger inspector's eyes widen when he saw the exposed piping the HOA had laid without cover or protection. That wasn't just unauthorized, it was reckless. Meanwhile, Denise went silent. I hadn't seen her since the day she watched the pumps switch on, standing like a queen surveying her conquered kingdom. Now she wasn't returning emails. I sent a certified letter demanding the removal of all HOA equipment from my property. No response. I followed it with a cease and desist filed with help from a lawyer Mark recommended, Bridget Collins, a short but formidable woman who specialized in HOA abuse cases. Bridget had fire in her eyes when I showed her the documentation. "This isn't just overreach," she said. "This is liability, on a silver platter. They're draining a lake without permits across private boundaries and causing visible ecological damage. You realize we can go for injunction damages and probably force a full audit of their environmental practices." I nodded. "Let's hit every button we can." She filed a motion for an emergency injunction within 2 days. In the meantime, I noticed something strange movement near the shoreline just after midnight. At first, I thought it was an animal. But when I looked through my binoculars, I saw 2 men in reflective vests detaching hoses from the pump motors and hauling them toward a service truck. I crept closer, camera in hand, and got clear footage of them removing equipment under cover of darkness. They were trying to backtrack, scrub their fingerprints. Too late. I uploaded the footage to a Google Drive folder I had titled Lake Gate and shared it with Bridget. She told me to be patient. The more they tried to hide, the worse they'd look in court. She was right. The next morning, the pumps were gone, but the damage remained. The lake was barely a foot deep in the deepest areas, a scarred basin of exposed muck and half-buried branches. But it wasn't just nature suffering. Their docks, those carefully crafted wooden piers HOA members bragged about during wine mixers, were now tragic punchlines. One had collapsed entirely, its planks splayed out like a broken rib cage. Another had tipped at a 45-degree angle and looked ready to plunge any moment. That afternoon, I flew the drone again, capturing sweeping shots of the destruction. Not just for evidence, but for posterity. This wasn't just about what they took from me. It was about what they destroyed in their arrogance. I uploaded the video to YouTube unlisted and titled it simply, "This is what the HOA did." Within hours, neighbors started texting. "Jack, is this real? Did they really do all that? I had no idea it was this bad." One message stood out, though. It was from a woman I didn't recognize, Mallory Fields. She identified herself as a former HOA board member who resigned the year before. Her message was short. "I know why they really drained the lake. I have the emails. Let me know if you want them." My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a second. Then I typed back, "Yes, absolutely. Send everything." Because now it wasn't just about fixing the lake. It was about exposing the truth and taking down every person who thought they could bulldoze their will through other people's lives. The stench was the first thing people noticed. It drifted through the trees like a warning, thick with the smell of decay, old fish rotting vegetation, and something sour that clung to your nose long after you'd left. What was once a peaceful living lake now resembled a battlefield aftermath, stripped of beauty, stripped of life. The water was gone. What remained was an open wound. I stood at the shoreline in my boots, scanning what used to be the West Bank. A year ago, Lucy and I had built a little wooden bench there just high enough for our feet to skim the water's surface. Now the bench looked ridiculous, perched above a dry crater. Next to it, The reeds were brown and curled, starved of moisture and sun. I stepped down into the basin, my feet sinking into soft mud that sucked at my soles like it wanted to pull me under. 10 feet out, the remains of a bluegill shimmered beneath a film of green algae. Its gills flared in a silent scream. I saw dozens more like it. Dead frogs, some still bloated, others shriveled to leather. A turtle carcass half buried near the north end. Dragonfly, larvae, ants, crawfish, all gone. Just days ago, this lake had been a complex little ecosystem. Now it was a mass grave. And towering above it all were the docks, 3 wooden structures the HOA had built without permits, years ago pitched as community features but slapped up quickly, cheaply, and entirely outside their jurisdiction. They jutted out now, like monuments to hubris. One lay cracked in half where its pilings had collapsed into soft clay. Another was tilted dangerously forward, as though leaning in shame. The third, Denise's prized sunset dock, had sunk 2 feet at the far end, the railing dangling at a limp angle. From a distance, it looked like the neck of a dying swan. Neighbors were starting to see it too, not just the physical collapse, but the moral rot behind it. I heard whisperings on the walking trail. I saw more people stop by the lake's edge, hands on their hips, frowning at the scene. A few took pictures. A few asked questions. One man, Alan, whose property backed up to the opposite shore, came by as I was documenting the area. "You think they'll fix it?" he asked. I looked up. "They'll have to. Or a judge will make them." He nodded slowly. "You know, my grandson used to catch frogs right over there." He pointed to a patch of mud, now dry and cracked. "Broke his heart when he saw it last week. Asked me if we'd had a drought." "No," I said. "We had an HOA." He didn't laugh. He just looked out at the dock and shook his head. That night, Mallory Fields emailed me a zip folder containing dozens of PDFs, screenshots, and email threads, internal HOA communications from the past 6 months. What I read sent ice through my spine. In a thread dated 4 weeks before the pumps arrived, Denise had written, "If we let the water level keep rising, we could be on the hook for dock repairs liability, nightmare waiting to happen. If we drop it now, we can frame it as flood prevention. I'll draft a statement." Another reply from Glenn Harrow. "We'll need to move fast before Mercer causes trouble. Use the safety clause. He's ex-military, might not take it well." And then from Denise again. "Let's just say it's for the community's protection. Most residents won't question it." They knew. They knew the docks were failing. They knew it was their fault. They drained the lake to avoid liability, and they thought they could scapegoat me in the process. I forwarded the emails to Bridget, who called me almost immediately. "This is gold," she said. "Intent, negligence, malice. You can't ask for a better foundation for damages. You think we can get it all. We can get more than that. We can take their seats, their money, and their reputation." The next morning, I printed 6 of the most damning email screenshots and posted them on a public corkboard outside the clubhouse, right beneath the HOA's flood update. I didn't add commentary. I didn't need to. The timestamps, the words, they spoke for themselves. By the end of the day, someone had ripped them down. But it didn't matter. I'd already posted them to the neighborhood's private social group online. Within 24 hours, the post had over 300 comments. And the tide turned. Residents began openly questioning the board. They shared photos of the dead wildlife. One woman, Miriam, wrote about how her son came home crying after finding a bloated catfish stuck in the mud where he used to kayak. Another man said the drainage had worsened erosion along the east side trail, causing his fence posts to buckle. The HOA's attempt to avoid one liability had unleashed a dozen new ones. At the center of it all were those docks, those crooked, drying relics of arrogance. The HOA had used the lake for years to boost property value, pad their brochures, and sell the illusion of a lakefront lifestyle. But now, every time someone looked out their window, they saw the truth: what happens when unchecked power meets quiet defiance. And I wasn't staying quiet anymore. The following week, Bridget filed the lawsuit. It included claims for trespass, property damage, negligence, ecological harm, unauthorized construction, and emotional distress. We named the HOA as a body, but also cited Denise Glenn Harrow and the board members individually. The evidence was overwhelming. We had emails, photos, videos, city code violations, and sworn statements from neighbors. As we walked out of the county courthouse after filing, Bridget looked at me and said, Now we wait. No, I replied, now we expose. I reached out to a local journalist, an old contact from my days consulting on infrastructure disasters. She met me at the lake with a cameraman and listened carefully as I walked her through the entire story. When I showed her the drone footage, she whispered, "You're kidding." When I showed her the emails, she said, "Oh, they're screwed." The piece aired 2 nights later. When the HOA goes too far, one man's battle to save his lake. The visuals were brutal. Sweeping drone shots of cracked earth, dead fish, broken docks, side-by-side maps showing my property line versus HOA jurisdiction. They even interviewed Alan, who choked up when describing how his grandson cried after seeing the drained shoreline. The story exploded. Within hours, I had reporters calling, city council members emailing, environmental groups offering statements. And then came the flood of support of outrage and of questions directed squarely at Denise. And still, the lake sat in silence, drained and dry. But for the first time since this began, I didn't feel helpless. I felt ready. In the military, they drill a phrase into your head. Document everything. It doesn't matter if you're on a forward operating base in Kandahar or staring down a bureaucrat in a suburban HOA, you keep the receipts. So that's what I did. By the time the story aired on the local news, I had over 200 photographs. 4 hours of drone footage, sworn declarations from 8 neighbors, 6 maps, thermal imaging of the soil degradation audio recordings from the HOA meeting, where Denise dismissed my concerns, and of course, the smoking gun, those emails. And yet, even with all that in hand, the most powerful weapon I had was still my voice. So I made a decision. I wasn't just going to sue. I was going to speak. The day after the news aired, the HOA tried to save face. A hasty newsletter was emailed out titled, "Setting the Record Straight," claiming the pumps were only active as a temporary precautionary measure, and that certain parties were spreading misinformation that does not reflect the HOA's full commitment to environmental safety. They even attached a stock photo of a lake from God knows where, certainly not ours, which at that point looked like a set from a post-apocalyptic film. I forwarded the email to Bridget, who replied with just 2 words, "Let them." Because with every lie they told, every shallow excuse they printed, they only dug themselves deeper. But I wasn't waiting anymore. That Saturday, I held a town hall of my own. I rented the small library event room just off Main Street. I expected maybe 10 people. 30 showed up. Some brought folding chairs, some brought kids. Some brought copies of the HOA bylaws, printed out and highlighted like college textbooks. I stood at the front next to a rolling projector screen wearing jeans boots and my old core polo, and I told them the truth. I showed them the drone footage from the day before the pumps, the lush waterline, the herons in flight. Then I clicked to the next video, the pumps roaring, the water churning away like it was being vacuumed from the earth. I showed them the emails enlarged on the screen. I didn't narrate. I didn't need to. I just let the words linger in the silence. If we let the water level keep rising, we could be on the hook for dock repairs. He's ex-military, might not take it well. I watched their faces shift from confusion to disgust to anger. A woman in the back raised her hand. "Can they be removed from the board?" "Yes," I said. "There's a clause in the HOA's own charter. If 51% of residents sign a removal petition, a vote is triggered within 30 days. That was the spark. A man named Darren stood up and said, "Then let's do it." The room erupted in murmurs of agreement. That night, we created a petition, printed out 300 copies, and distributed them door to door. I stayed up until 2 a.m. responding to messages from neighbors who were shocked, furious, or finally ready to act. The very next morning, I took Ranger out for a walk around the dried lake bed. He sniffed at the mud, cautious but curious. The air smelled a little cleaner. Maybe it was psychological. Maybe it was hope. I stopped at the western dock, the one that had collapsed. I knelt and ran my hand along a jagged break in the railing. The wood was soft, rotting, unsealed. It would have been a lawsuit waiting to happen if someone's kid had fallen through. Denise hadn't drained the lake to protect people. She drained it to protect herself. I pulled out my phone and took a photo angled just right so you could see the empty lake, the cracked mud, and the broken dock. Then I uploaded it to the petition website under the headline, "This is what they left us with." By that afternoon, we had 187 signatures. The tipping point came when the city's Environmental Impact Task Force made a public statement. Crofton Landing HOA's drainage actions were conducted without permits, environmental oversight, or legal jurisdiction. We are actively investigating the extent of ecological and property damage. That statement spread like wildfire. Local blogs, social groups, even regional environmental nonprofits began sharing the story. And with every repost, with every screenshot of the docks or the carcasses, or the damning emails, the narrative shifted. From flood control to full-blown scandal. I had done more than take pictures. I'd created a movement. By day 5, the petition passed 51%. We triggered the removal vote. Denise Glenn Harrow and the remaining 2 board members were officially on the chopping block. But I wasn't done. Bridget filed an amended complaint in civil court citing intentional infliction of emotional distress, environmental negligence, and property trespass with malice. With the emails with the footage and with the statements from other neighbors, our case was airtight. And then, another break, the city received an anonymous tip that the HOA had siphoned the lake water into an old storm drain system that hadn't been used or maintained in nearly 2 decades. The excess water had flooded a wooded area behind the greenbelt, damaging several trees and causing slope instability. Now the city's forestry department was involved. The HOA wasn't just in trouble, they were in multiple jurisdictions of trouble. One evening, while organizing documents in my garage, Lucy came in and asked, "Do you think the lake will come back?" I looked at her, 16 now, taller than I remembered her being, just weeks before standing there with her hands tucked into the sleeves of an oversized hoodie. Her voice cracked just slightly on the word back. I stood up and put a hand on her shoulder. "Yes," I said. "But not just the lake. The truth. And respect. Maybe even trust." She looked at me with something I hadn't seen in a while. Pride. That quiet burning kind that doesn't need words. That night, as I sat by the fire pit in the backyard, I scrolled through the thousands of pictures I'd taken over the past month. The lush greens, the dead silence, the ripped docks, the signatures, the headlines, all of it a testament. Because sometimes the only way to fight those who think they're untouchable is to show the world what they've touched. And I had. The hearing was scheduled for 10:00 a.m. at the Buncombe County Courthouse. I arrived at 9:05 sharp, a habit I never broke even after the Army. I wore a dark blazer, clean jeans, and my father's wristwatch-worn leather band, faded face, still ticking after all these years. Bridget met me at the courthouse steps with a steel briefcase and eyes that said, we were going in not just to fight, but to win. "Looks like we've got an audience," she said. She wasn't kidding. A small crowd had gathered outside, neighbors, reporters, and even a few curious city employees. Someone from the Asheville Tribune was setting up a tripod. And there on the steps were Denise Clymer and Glenn Harrow standing stiffly in matching Navy suits like defendants trying to act like diplomats. They refused to look at me. That was fine. Inside the hearing room, the air buzzed with tension. The judge, Honorable Marie Langdon, a no-nonsense woman with wire-rimmed glasses and a reputation for crushing bureaucratic overreach, walked in precisely on time. Her gavel struck once. The room stilled. "This is a preliminary hearing on the matter of Mercer v. Crofton Landing, HOA," she said, flipping through the folder in front of her. Plaintiff alleges environmental negligence, property trespass, and civil rights violations under county water protection statutes. Bridget stood and stated our case with military precision, outlining the timeline, presenting photos, permits, city statements, and finally a printed copy of the now viral HOA email thread. She handed it directly to Judge Langdon, who skimmed the lines silently. "Let's just say it's for the community's protection," she read aloud. Interesting phrasing. The courtroom murmured. Bridget continued, "Your Honor, these actions were not only unauthorized, they were taken with full knowledge of legal wrongdoing. My client's lake was drained without permits, his property trespassed upon his ecosystem, destroyed, and his reputation attacked, all to protect unpermitted docks built by the HOA for community prestige." Denise's lawyer, a gray-haired man named Stanley Pierce, stood next. He began with the usual hollow apologies. "Your Honor, the HOA board acted in what it believed was the best interest of the community. While we acknowledge procedural missteps," Langdon raised her hand. "Mr. Pierce, I've reviewed the documentation. I'm not seeing a misstep. I'm seeing willful overreach, Stanley Pierce stammered, if I may. No, you may not, she snapped. What I see here is a board operating outside its jurisdiction, making structural changes to private land, and jeopardizing not only Mr. Mercer's rights, but also city infrastructure. You're lucky this isn't a criminal proceeding. Yet. Denise shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Glenn Harrow's jaw clenched. Then came the real moment of impact. Bridget wheeled in a mounted projector screen and played a 30-second clip from our drone footage showing the pumps in action, then cutting to the collapsed dock and the dry, dead lake bed. The room was dead quiet. When the screen went black, the silence lingered. Langdon finally spoke. Based on what I've seen today, I am authorizing an emergency injunction against any further HOA activity on or around Mr. Mercer's property. Effective immediately, the HOA is ordered to cease all operations pertaining to lake drainage shoreline alteration or environmental modification. Denise exhaled almost in relief until the next line. Furthermore, the HOA will be required to hire a third-party environmental restoration firm approved by the city to assess and restore the lake to pre-drainage levels. And you will pay for it. Gasps rang out across the courtroom. Langdon's gavel struck again. Mr. Mercer, you are entitled to pursue further damages in civil court. This hearing is adjourned. As we stepped outside, reporters crowded in. Microphones, flashbulbs, a flood of questions. Mr. Mercer, how do you feel about today's ruling? Will you pursue full damages against the HOA? Do you think Denise Clymer should resign? I raised a hand. I didn't ask for this fight. I just wanted to protect what was mine. What's ours? Nature doesn't have a voice in these rooms. I gave it one. Bridget pulled me aside, her voice low. There's something else. The city just issued a code enforcement notice. The docks, they've been condemned. I blinked. You serious? They'll have to remove all three within 30 days or face daily fines. I looked across the parking lot at Denise, who stood frozen near the HOA's SUV. Her carefully crafted image of control had cracked like the boards of her rotting dock. Glenn Harrow avoided eye contact, fiddling with his car keys like they were a parachute he couldn't find the ripcord to. You know, I said for a group that wanted to drain a lake to protect their property, they ended up knee-deep in mud anyway. Bridget grinned. We drove back to Crofton Landing in silence, the kind of silence that feels full, not empty. I parked near the lake now, a crater with promise. It was still ugly, still wounded, but it was mine again. And soon it would live again. Later that night, I walked to the end of my backyard with Ranger and stood at the water's edge, or what used to be. The moon lit up the field of cracked mud, and in the far corner I saw something flicker, a small puddle, no bigger than a dinner plate, but shimmering faintly. A remnant. A beginning. Ranger looked up at me and wagged his tail. Almost home, buddy, I whispered. Almost. If the hearing was the explosion, what came after was the fallout. The courtroom victory lit a match under the HOA. But it was the internal emails, hundreds of them, that poured gasoline on the fire. What Mallory sent me was only the beginning. After the injunction, more former board members came forward. Disillusioned, disgruntled, or just done with Denise's dictatorship, they began to peel back the layers of what had been hidden behind HOA doors for years. One of them, Todd Langston, had served on the board for 6 years before quitting last summer. He met me at a local diner, nervous and jittery, stirring his coffee so much the cream never settled. She manipulated us, he said. Denise ran that board like it was a corporation. We barely voted on anything. She'd send a consensus draft by email, and if no one replied, she took it as approval. You mean you didn't read what she sent? I asked. Not all of it. Most of us had jobs, families. She knew that. She weaponized our silence. He slid a flash drive across the table. This is everything I saved. Internal threads, attachments, meeting minutes, real ones, not the ones they post publicly. You're going to want to read it all. And I did. That night, I plugged the drive into my laptop and began combing through it. I wasn't prepared for what I found. Emails dated nearly 2 years prior revealed a long-standing pattern of manipulation. Denise rewriting meeting summaries before publishing them, cutting out dissenting voices, editing board member comments to sound more favorable to her plans, even using HOA funds for community beautification projects that coincidentally improved her own property value. But it wasn't just dishonesty, it was control. She'd pressured vendors to skip competitive bidding, chosen her personal friend's landscaping company for triple the going rate, and had quietly diverted funds from HOA reserve accounts to cover the cost of constructing the docks. In one email to Glenn Harrow, she wrote, "Mercer's Lake is a ticking time bomb. If something happens, it falls on us. But if we act now, we can shift the blame." Another thread between her and the HOA's former treasurer was even more damning. "Treasurer, you can't move funds from long-term reserve to current ops without a member vote. That's against our own charter." "Denise, then don't list it as that. Mark it as emergency repairs." No one reads the breakdowns. I sat back in my chair stunned. The drainage wasn't a mistake. It was the latest in a long chain of abuses masked by red tape, buried in spreadsheets, and written in polite language that sounded like leadership but smelled like rot. Bridget was speechless when I sent her the files. Then, with lawyerly glee, she said, "We're going to bury them." By now, word had spread far beyond our little cul-de-sac. Local radio stations were talking about it. One regional paper ran a Sunday feature titled, "When HOA Power Goes Too Far, a Neighborhood Drained by Control." The picture said it all. The broken docks, the mud cracks, the children's drawings pinned to the clubhouse door that read, "Bring the lake back." Then came the audits. The city launched a full investigation into HOA spending. A forensic accountant was appointed. At the same time, Bridget filed for discovery in our civil suit forcing the HOA to hand over even more internal communications. And what they didn't know, what Denise never saw coming, was that one of her own had flipped. Todd wasn't just a former board member. He had admin access to the HOA's cloud archive. And when he turned over the access codes, we gained entry to every file, every draft policy, every budget item going back 10 years. It was all there. A falsified flood assessment to justify a $42,000 landscaping job. A fake contractor invoice paid to Glenn Harrow's brother-in-law. Photos of unpermitted dock construction with timestamps that predated the board approval. Bridget assembled a 114-page exhibit and submitted it to the judge. When we met in her office, she placed the thick binder between us like a war trophy. "You realize," she said, "we're no longer just fighting to restore the lake. We're blowing up their entire regime." Good. I didn't just want justice. I wanted accountability. For every property owner charged bogus fees. For every tree cut down without consent. For every inch of control they took from people too tired or intimidated to push back. Meanwhile, the community was transforming. The petition to remove the board was complete. A formal vote was scheduled for the following Saturday at the community center. The new candidates, people like Russell, Miriam, even Alan, were running on platforms of transparency, environmental stewardship, and homeowner rights. And Denise, she was unraveling. She released a shaky video message to the community filmed from her perfectly staged living room, claiming she had acted in good faith and that outside forces were attempting to sow division. Her voice cracked when she said, "I only ever wanted what was best for Crofton Landing." But no one believed her anymore. Her carefully crafted image, community leader, protector, visionary, was now in tatters. Even the people who once praised her monthly newsletters now ignored her emails. On the night before the vote, Lucy joined me again by the edge of the lake. We stood in silence for a long time, watching the stars reflected in the small pools of water, beginning to gather after a week of gentle rain. "It's coming back," she said. "It always does," I replied. "If you give it room." She looked up at me. "You really fought for this." "I had to," I said. "Not just for the lake, for what it stood for." She smiled just a little and leaned against my arm. That was the moment I realized. This fight wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming the space we were supposed to be safe in. A backyard, a lake, a neighborhood, a voice. And come morning, that voice would cast a vote that changed everything. Saturday morning broke cold and gray, the kind of morning where everything feels suspended in stillness, like the air itself is holding its breath. By 8:30 a.m., the community center parking lot was full. Lawn chairs, strollers, car trunks popped open like tailgates. What had once been a sleepy suburban HOA election had become a full-blown reckoning. I stood near the edge of the crowd, coffee in hand, watching families shuffle in. Not one person wore a Crofton Landing HOA polo or hat that morning. That brand had been burned to the ground. Inside, the atmosphere was taut with electricity. Denise sat in the front row, arms crossed over a burgundy sweater, lips pursed so tight they were barely visible. Glenn Harrow sat beside her, expression blank. They looked like relic symbols of a regime already dead, but too stubborn to admit it. The vote was simple, yes or no, to recall the board and trigger a full re-election. They needed 51%. They got 74%. Applause erupted. Not polite clapping, but real cheers, people hugging, high-fiving, even crying. Denise stood as if she might say something, but no microphone was offered. She quietly gathered her purse and walked out. Glenn Harrow followed a step behind, his head bowed. The new board, Russell, Miriam Allen, and two others I hadn't met, took their seats minutes later, greeted with applause louder than the first. They looked stunned, but grateful. Before the meeting adjourned, Russell approached the podium and cleared his throat. "We want to thank every single person here. We know trust has been damaged. We can't fix everything in a day, but we will fix it." He paused, then looked toward me. "And Jack Mercer, thank you. This neighborhood owes you a debt." I nodded, once humbled. It wasn't about thanks. It was about getting back what mattered. But the battle wasn't over yet. On Monday morning, we returned to civil court for the first full hearing in the lawsuit. Bridget was in full command heels, clicking down the marble hall like rifle shots. The defendants, now former board members, arrived with different lawyers this time. No more HOA paid legal shield. Now it was personal. Judge Langdon presided once more. She looked even less patient than before. Today we begin full proceedings in the case of Mercer Vierster Crofton Landing, HOA Clymer Harrow, and unnamed board members in individual and collective capacities, she said. All parties are under oath. Let's begin. What followed felt like a courtroom drama made for television. Bridget laid out our opening argument with surgical clarity, walking the court through the timeline, the unauthorized drainage, the permits that didn't exist, the ecological damage, the fabricated HOA reports, and finally the internal communications proving intent and malice. We presented over 300 exhibits. The drone videos, the environmental reports, the cross-referenced email logs showing exactly when Denise lied to the board and when Glenn Harrow backed her up. We called witnesses. The city engineer who confirmed the drainage path was unauthorized, a biologist who testified to the ecological damage, a neighbor whose child had been injured slipping on exposed mud left behind by the drained basin. Then it was their turn. Their lawyers flailed. They tried to argue that the HOA bylaws allowed for emergency response action. Judge Langdon interrupted. Emergency response requires actual evidence of an emergency. You had none. They argued that the lake wasn't technically on my property. I produced the deed, and the GPS overlays, and the city assessor's sworn statement confirming boundary ownership. They argued that the docks were built with HOA funds, and therefore had legal standing. Bridget raised her brow. Yes, she said, funds that were misappropriated, used without vote, and applied to unpermitted structures that now pose safety hazards. The judge nodded. Not only are they liable, I'm considering referring this to the district attorney. That got everyone's attention. By the third day of testimony, the opposing side's confidence had vanished. Denise no longer looked like a president. She looked like someone waiting to hear a sentence. And when Langdon gave her ruling, it hit like a hammer. I find in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Mercer, on all counts, she said. She listed the damages allowed. $67,000 for ecological restoration, $35,000 for property damages, $15,000 in emotional distress, $10,000 in legal fees, and punitive damages totaling $50,000 for willful misconduct and abuse of power. In addition, she said, I am referring this case to the city attorney for review of potential criminal misuse of HOA funds and public misrepresentation. Denise turned ghost pale. Glenn Harrow visibly trembled. Bridget didn't smile. Neither did I. There was no joy in it, only justice. And justice doesn't need to grin. Outside the courtroom, news cameras waited again. I gave one short statement. This wasn't about me. It was about the principle that no one, no board, no HOA, no small group of individuals has the right to steal from their community and hide behind paperwork. That night, when I returned home, I walked down to the edge of the lake. The pumps were gone. The mud was firming. The new environmental crew paid for by the judgment had already marked restoration zones and brought in planting gear. And then for the first time in months, I heard it. A frog. Just one. But loud, brazen, proud. I smiled. The lawsuit shook the HOA. But it also shook something loose in the people here. Their apathy, their resignation, their sense that nothing can be done. Because now they'd seen what could happen when someone stood up. And they weren't sitting down again anytime soon. 2 weeks after the ruling, the demolition crew arrived with heavy equipment. It was just after sunrise when the first excavator rolled onto the dried lake bed, steel treads cracking across the mud like a slow drumbeat of justice. I stood on my porch with Ranger by my side, coffee in hand, watching as they approached the rotten skeletons of the HOA docks. Those docks had stood for almost 8 years, ugly monuments to arrogance disguised as amenities. They were never permitted, never maintained, and never meant to last. But HOA Karen and her crew had used them to sell the neighborhood to new buyers, to host exclusive resident socials, and when it suited them to pretend they were stewards of nature. Now they were nothing but liabilities, ready to be pulled up by their foundations and tossed into a wood chipper. I walked down toward the site boots, squelching slightly in the softening ground. One of the contractors, a wiry guy, in a reflective vest and thick gloves, saw me coming and waved. "You, Jack Mercer." I nodded. He grinned. "We've been looking forward to this." I stayed for hours silently watching as they dismantled every plank, every post. Each swing of the excavator's arm felt like a cathartic release. When the second dock caved in with a loud crack, a small group of neighbors watching from the trail clapped. Russell brought donuts. Miriam brought folding chairs. The HOA's empire, built on a foundation of manipulation and muddy secrets, was finally being dug up, literally. And yet what struck me most was not the destruction. It was the rebuilding that followed. The restoration crew hired through the environmental settlement arrived the same week. Unlike the men who drained the lake in the dead of night, these folks worked in daylight. They came with biology degrees and notebooks, not bulldozers. They tested the soil, flagged endangered plant roots, set up erosion barriers, installed native reeds and water lilies. They spoke in quiet, respectful tones and consulted with me on every step. "Your work here," one of them said, "was actually ahead of its time. You restored this lake right. We're just helping it recover from trauma." That word trauma hit me in the chest, because it wasn't just the lake that had suffered. My neighbors had lived for years under the slow, suffocating rule of an HOA that used bureaucracy as a bludgeon. They'd been fined for lawn lengths, reprimanded for fence colors, penalized for parking slightly off-center. Most of them had just taken it. Not because they were weak, but because the machine felt too big to fight. But not anymore. Now the machine was in pieces. After the court case, the city had launched its own investigation into HOA financials. Turns out Denise had been diverting funds from multiple accounts to pay for emergency improvements, including a new clubhouse roof that was never inspected, and several landscape design projects at Glenn Harrow's personal residence. The new board froze all spending and opened the books. What they found shocked even the cynics. Nearly $140,000 unaccounted for over a 4-year period. Fake invoices, duplicate contractor payments, service charges to vendors that didn't exist. An emergency meeting was called. This time, the community center was packed wall to wall. Russell stood before the crowd and read the audit findings aloud. Each revelation drew gasps, then groans, then rising anger. When he finished, someone from the back shouted, "Prosecute them." And they did. Criminal referrals were made. A grand jury was impaneled. Within a month, both Denise and Glenn Harrow were indicted on charges of misappropriation of funds fraud and violation of environmental statutes. Their mugshots were printed in the local paper just below a headline that read, "From HOA royalty to criminal defendants." Neighbors who had once whispered complaints now spoke openly, confidently. They organized cleanup days, voted on new rules, held meetings that actually listened to residents. The community newsletter stopped being a propaganda rag and started including real updates, budgets, schedules, transparency. And the lake began to breathe again. The water level rose slowly, like lungs refilling after a long exhale. Replanted lilies began to bloom. Dragonflies returned. Turtles poked their heads above the water. And one early morning, I spotted a blue heron standing tall at the southern edge, silent, elegant home again. One Saturday, Lucy and I put the bench back in place. The same one we'd built years ago, the one that used to overlook the water, and then sat like an artifact above dust. Now it faced the shimmer of returning life. "You think it'll ever be the same?" she asked. "No," I said. "It'll be better." She smiled. "Maybe you should join the board." I laughed. "Let's not get carried away." But others did step up. People who'd never spoken at meetings now helped lead them. Quiet retirees became watchdogs. Young parents drafted bylaws. The neighborhood didn't just heal, it evolved. Denise's house went up for sale shortly after the indictment. Rumor was she'd moved in with a cousin in Florida. Glenn Harrow vanished overnight. No one mourned their exits. And me, I finally rested. For the first time in a year, I stopped checking the shoreline every morning in fear. I stopped photographing everything in case I needed it as evidence. I started planting wildflowers again. Started teaching Lucy how to cast a fly line without spooking the water. Started living again. One afternoon, I walked the edge of the lake and noticed something in the mud, half buried, coated in clay, barely visible. I knelt and dug it out, a small rusted placard. It read, HOA Doc Number 2, Community Funded 2016. I turned it over, wiped off the muck, and carried it back to the house. Mounted it above my workbench, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that even the biggest empires can sink in the mud when they're built on lies. It started slowly, a few inches at a time, like the earth itself was testing whether it was safe to trust again. The rains came gently, that fall, steady and respectful, not the violent kind that caused flash floods or erosion. The lake bed, once split by cracks like open wounds, absorbed each drop with reverence. And in time, the water began to hold. By mid-November, I could walk to the edge of the shore and see my reflection again. Not distorted in dry ripples or lost in brown dust, clear right there on the surface, like the place itself was finally speaking back. The environmental crew returned weekly to monitor progress. They planted native sedges along the banks, repaired erosion damage, and even introduced a few fish species. Once the water level stabilized, they moved with purpose, but also with care. One of them, Melissa, knelt in the shallows with a net of tadpoles and said, "It's rare to see a space recover like this. You did it justice." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and watched the water ripple around her boots. Lucy spent her afternoons here again. She brought a sketch pad and drew the changing shoreline. One day, she pointed to the far side of the lake, near the newly restored reeds, and said, "It looks like a scar, but a healed one. You can still see it, but it's not bleeding anymore." It was one of those moments where I realized she'd grown up without me noticing. In December, the city sent an official letter of closure. The investigation was complete. All remediation steps had been fulfilled. The property boundaries were reaffirmed. The HOA was officially barred from initiating any environmental interventions without full resident approval and municipal permitting. And for the first time, in the 7 years I'd lived in Crofton Landing, the HOA newsletter actually started with the words, "We were wrong." The new board signed it collectively. They thanked residents for their patience, acknowledged past missteps, and outlined a new transparency policy. Open meetings, public votes, full financial disclosures every quarter. They even created a community restoration committee and asked if I'd be willing to chair it. I declined, but I promised to support it. I didn't want power. I had what I came for: peace. Not the passive kind, not silence, but earned, enduring peace. The kind that rises only after something is fought for and rebuilt, like a lake that refuses to stay dry. And that peace came with more than water. Neighbors stopped and talked again. Russell walked the shoreline every morning and waved from the opposite bank. Miriam started a wildflower program, planting seeds along the trails that now wound beside the recovering lake. Children returned too, laughing, splashing, shrieking as they chased frogs in the shallows. It wasn't perfect, but it was beautiful. One day in early spring, I noticed something I hadn't seen in over a year. A pair of herons nesting on the north bank. I stood quiet and still, not wanting to startle them. They moved like sentinels, calm, cautious, proud. One stepped into the water, dipped its beak, and took flight, its wings scattering a perfect arc of droplets into the sun. I watched it go. Not as a soldier, not as a litigant, not as a man wronged, just as someone home. That night, I walked into the garage and looked again at the rusted placard mounted above my workbench. HOA Doc Number 2. Community Funded 2016. Next to it, I'd hung a new frame, a printed photo of the lake in full bloom reeds in the foreground, a child's kite flying in the background. Underneath, I'd written in bold marker, "We drain what we fear, but life returns when we protect what we love." I thought about everything that had happened, the pumps, the emails, the hearings, the docks sinking into the mud. And I realized the greatest change hadn't been the water. It had been the people, the quiet ones who finally stood up, the tired ones who still chose to hope, the frightened ones who dared to speak the truth out loud, and me, just a man with a lake who didn't back down. In a world where too many people give up because it's easier, we didn't. We drained the lies. We refilled the truth. We restored what mattered. So now when I sit by the water at dusk, coffee in hand, ranger at my feet, and the wind soft in the pines, I don't feel like I won a war. I feel like I reclaimed a home. And I'll be damned if I ever let anyone take that away again.